In another scene in the city, and about some of the incidents there. The city was witnessing a boom in thefts and selling drugs. And the gangs were spread all over the city. The local police almost did not control the young criminals who worked for their own account. On the contrary, it is trying to cooperate with them in solving some criminal cases and to find out about the killers. Or the perpetrators of some crimes. This cooperation was not openly, but in secret, and the gangs used to benefit from this cooperation by promoting drugs to the utmost benefit. There were two gangs in the city. These two gangs were controlling the market of the drugs in the city. They are considered the richest and the most powerful, as both of them had possession of the weapons which may excel munitions of the police in the city. These two gangs were constantly fighting each other over influence, revenge, and trying to take revenge on each other. The days of the truce were almost few compared to the months of the conflict until the residents of the city and the police became accustomed to these conflicts. The northern gang of the city was led by Philip and the southern gang of the city was led by Stephen. And the gangs were administratively organized, and the penalty for betrayal was killing the traitor and his family sometimes. There is no room for betrayal or retreat from the gang under any circumstance, whatever the cost was. The conflict between Steve and Philip was at its most intense. It happened that one of the members of the northern gang was staying up late at night in a bar drinking some wine, and when he was leaving late, he stole a pickup truck and drove it to a warehouse for his northern gang. And he did not know that it belonged to a member of the southern gang. And that its drive was about to deliver a cargo of drugs which had a value of millions of dollars. Which had been put in a bag and that bag was put behind the driver's seat. He stopped the pickup truck and slept in the warehouse. Unaware that he had caused the start of a strong war in the city. The driver of the pickup truck got out of the bar and did not find it. And immediately he called the gang members. And the news reached Stephen, who ordered to kill the driver who was supposed to deliver the cargo without stopping. As well as an order to search for the pickup truck. The driver was killed and the search for the pickup truck in the city began. The news reached the chief of the police, the officer Nelson, who called both Stephen and Philip to ask them about the suspicious movements of gangsters. Everyone denied anything unusual in the city, and the communications ended on that basis. After 2 days in the warehouse, the thief of the pickup truck was searching it and found the bag full of drugs. So he was afraid and delivered the news to his leader Philip. Philip came to find out that there was the purest type of heroin inside it. That was 100 kilos, whose price had the value of $20 million at the least estimation. He ordered the car to be completely destroyed and the narcotic substance to be preserved. Stephen did not stop searching for the drugs that belonged to him. But he did not find a trace of them until he decided to search with the small drug dealers, because that quantity was difficult to be sold except in this way. If he found that pure narcotic substance with possession of one of them, he would certainly find the person who had stolen it. And actually members of the gang began searching in the streets, but in vain. In another scene, Philip began to think of a way to sell this large amount of pure heroin, which might bring him a fortune, until he decided to sell it retail. But his gang members warned him of that behavior that might give a proof to the southern gang that he was the doer of the theft. And the war would take place and he would not benefit from anything. And they gave him advice that the solution was that it would be sold to only one person outside the city and receive the amount in complete secrecy. Indeed, everyone expressed their complete agreement to that opinion. Philip called one of his friends outside the city to offer him these drugs, and said to him, "I must meet you," and the interview took place at the North Gang's warehouse. And he tasted the substance. And he said, "Really, this substance is one of the purest I have seen, and I will find you a buyer from outside the city within a week." After a week, he made him a telephone call, and said to him, "The customer is ready. Time and place of purchase must be set. And a restaurant has been agreed upon at night because the place is empty of people and the lack of workers in the restaurant. And the matter will not take place for long. The seller will take the money bag and the buyer will receive the drug bag quickly. And everyone will go quietly, and all parties have agreed." In that city where the broker and some of his friends in a small bar, That broker drank a lot of alcohol and told his friends that he had arranged a purchase of a very high-quality product in the city of the two gangs. And one of the small drug promoters was sitting next to them. That man was aware of the theft of drugs from the Southern gang in that city. So he actually bartered members of the Southern gang, so that the Southern gang members obtain all the information about the deal, including the location and time of delivery. Stephen was happy with this news and agreed to an amount of $1 million for that person. That person began to recruit his friends, including some members of the buyer's gang, without their knowledge of what he would do with that information. So he intended them to have drink and free nights until he reached one of the great gangsters, who told him during the evening that the deal would take place in that city after a week. And that one who would do the job was the person who was sitting next to him, and started hitting the person he was sitting next to him with his hand, saying, "This is the hero who is nominated to do this mission." And everyone began to laugh. And that mediator was happy with that information that would made him earn $1 million. The mediator called Stephen and told him that he had identified the person who would receive the cargo, and within a week he would inform him of the time he left the city. The rest was his, and the two agreed that $1 million would be delivered to him when he received his own cargo. He began to watch that man intensively until one day he rode his car and headed outside of his city. And when he was sure that he was heading to Stephen's city, he called Stephen and confirmed that the buyer had already headed to the city, and told him about his car color, specifications of his car, specifications of the person, and he was not so old man. Stephen was happy, but he was reckless, inclined to murder and violence in all his behavior. So he was saying to his gang member, "I will kill this buyer. I will kill Philip's gang members and take my drugs." But his gang members disagreed with him and said, "We do not know the details of the deal. It must done by the person himself, and on completing the deal, we will kill the buyer and the seller. Then we will take the drugs and the amount of purchase. At that time we will have guaranteed the completion of the deal and get the drugs and the amount with the least losses." Stephen applauded the idea and agreed. The buyer entered the city from the only side from which he was supposed to enter, and he was in the mobilization of the members of the Southern gang, and he was monitored and chased up. And they contacted their leader Stephen, who ordered not to do anything that made that buyer notice their pursuit of him. And what he wanted was indeed done until that buyer stopped in front of a restaurant. That restaurant was Mrs. Meckel's restaurant. It was a quiet restaurant where only Mrs. Michel worked, and there were not many customers. Before members of the gangs entered the restaurant, John had arrived in the city and entered the restaurant, and began to greet Mrs. Meckel and explain to her the reason for his quick return from the village, and that he had come for the purpose of buying a pickup truck for the people of the village. And he was sitting on the bar with his bag on the ground. One of the members of the Northern gang entered with the drug bag in his hand and sat in the restaurant. But he did not sit at the bar, but he sat at a table at the end of the restaurant waiting for the buyer, who was aware that he was not present at that moment. The buyer entered and sat on the bar next to John and put his bag on the floor next to John's bag. The members of the Northern gang are in their cars in front of the restaurant in anticipation of any emergency or possible betrayal. The Southern gang members were also waiting for the end of the deal, killing everyone, obtaining drugs and the purchase amount. Members of the Northern gang did not know absolutely that members of the Southern gang were existed in the location. The general scene was just watching and communicating with phones from everyone, weapons on standby. Some gangsters were already starting to sweat from an imminent battle. The buyer looked at John, who was certain that he was the seller and that he was the person commissioned to deliver the drugs, because his appearance was close to the appearance they told him about, and there was a bag next to him. So he was sure that he was, and asked him how he was, to which Joan replied confidently that he was fine and asked him how he was. So the buyer was sure that he was the person to whom he would deliver the drugs for his self-confidence and sedate reply. John continued his conversation with Meckel while the buyer switched bags and continued drinking beer. John took the bag and went to his room. John's room was above the restaurant, so it was not necessary to leave the restaurant. But at the end of the restaurant, there was a bathroom and a staircase that connected him to his room. Concerning the buyer, he sat for some minutes, while the real seller of the Northern gang was sitting at his place at the end of restaurant waiting. He received a call confirming to him that the buyer was actually at the restaurant and had the bag of money. Then he turned to find the buyer leaving the restaurant with John's bag in which he had his own clothes and $100,000, with which John was about to buy the truck in for the village members. When the buyer got out of the restaurant, the Southern gang attacked him and shot him and took the bag, and when they opened it, they found John's clothes and $100,000, so they started shouting, "Betrayal, treason." As for the members of the Northern gang, they recognized the leaders of the Southern gang, and orders came from the leaders of the two gangs to kill everyone, and exchanged fire. They were heavily armed, and the war took place between them, and a large number of the two gangs were killed. Mrs. Meckel hid at the end of the restaurant, as well as John, who opened the window from the top and saw the gang members fighting. He closed the window and hid in the room until they heard the police's sounds, and the remaining gangs fled, leaving the rest dead in front of the restaurant. Meckel went out of her hiding place to see a frightening sight of the bodies in the parking area and saw John's bag in front of the restaurant. She took it and put it in the restaurant. Joan went down and saw the scene. He was very frightened, and Meckel gave him his bag, and due to the severity of fear, he did not realize that he had already climbed up a short while ago with a bag that looked like it. After he climbed to his room a little time ago, Meckel saw another bag that looked like Joan's bag. Then she said, "Poor Joan, he was so scared that he forget his bag again." She did not know that inside that bag there was pure heroin, which was estimated at $20 million, and put it inside the restaurant. The police and paramedics came to the location, took the fingerprints, did the filming, and the police chief said this was the work of the gangs in the north and south. And they began to question whoever was at the location, including Meckel, and told them what happened without knowing the reason behind what happened. When they had left, she took the bag and gave it to Joan. She and Joan were astonished about what they concluded. They had 3 bags: John's bag, a bag of money with $20 million inside it, and a bag of heroin drugs. Joan was in great fear, as well as Mrs. Meckel, and they agreed to conceal the matter because the gangs would kill them if they knew. And also the police would arrest them and no one would believe them. The bags were with Joan and he did not know what to do with them. As for the Southern and Northern gangs and the buyer's gang in the other city, they all did not know where the money and drugs were, and each gang accused the other of treason. And the war began among them until the members of the police were annoyed with the killings and assassinations for weeks, until the police chief decided to gather the gang leaders and sit together and try to find out who caused this chaos, and actually all of them sat. Everyone wanted to know who was actually the responsible, while everyone denied having possession of money and drugs. At the beginning of the session, Stephen began accusing Philip that he was the one who stole drugs from the start, and the police chief calmed him down. While Philip said that was not the right time for those accusations because you lost drugs and I lost $20 million. I already owed it to someone I knew. The war would take place between me and him. If I did not give it back to him, his man had been killed. And I did not know where the money was if it was not really with you. The chief of the police suggested that he should re-interrogate whoever was in the restaurant, including Mrs. Meckel. And everyone agreed to a truce and stop killing and destruction, and everyone agreed. The chief of the police went to Mrs. Meckel and questioned her, and she was frightened. She denied any relationship with what had happened. And she was a woman who ran that restaurant to earn only her daily living, and he noticed that the restaurant was equipped with surveillance cameras, and he did not ask her about the cameras. But he went to the bar from the inside, found the tape recorder, took the recording tapes and took Michael with him to the police headquarters to review the tapes, and told her that it was a routine they always did. At the police headquarters, the recording went back to the same day of the accident. Indeed, everyone saw Joan sitting with his bag, and next to him was a man with his bag, and John had already taken the bag, and he went out and saw the beginning of the war that had begun. Everyone was surprised and asked Mrs. Meckel who that young man was, so she denied her knowledge of him. The chief of the police thought that he was a member of a gang. So he released Meckel, who went to John immediately and told him that your picture was with the police and that they would arrest you as soon as possible. Fear intensified for John, and he fled to the woods with the 3 bags, his personal bag, the drug bag, and the money bag, and he remained there waiting. As for the police chief, he met the leaders of the gangs and everyone looked at the video, and everyone denied their knowledge of this young man. Even his photo was distributed to the members of the gangs, and everyone denied knowing him. It was settled for everyone that Joan was a dangerous criminal, as he had already managed to deceive 3 drug gangs who were in complete control of the city. One of them working in another city, and they put an attractive sum of money for anyone who could arrest him alive or dead. This news reached Mrs. Meckel, who brought him to Joan because Joan, at the end of the night, was coming stealthily to Mrs. Michel to investigate news. Joan was more afraid of them. Mrs. Meckel feared for John, who considered him as her son, and Joan went hiding in the woods. When the police chief was sure that the person who appeared in the video did not belong to the gangsters, he ordered his photo to appear on television and that a photo to be distributed in public places to show his image in front of everyone that he was interested in the security of the city and that boy had caused dozens of deaths. And he was primarily responsible for selling and promoting drugs and leading the most powerful gangs. He accused him on the air, to increase his popularity and calm the folly of the criminal gangs. John was a victim of the police chief's thought. John appeared on TV and the alleged crimes were stuck to him and against him, and everyone started talking about this dangerous criminal. Everyone started talking about him at the university, with some astonishment because he was one of the most outstanding students. As for others, they remembered his position while he was hitting the boy and trying to break his hand and said that he was really a dangerous criminal. Only the lady knew the truth. Meckel and Joan himself would not be believed by anyone even if they tried. They would not survive the gang's murder and they had already taken money and drugs. As for the village, the situation was not better than the city, as the news reached the members of the 3 villages who met and accused Joan's father of treason, and that their son practiced criminal actions, and he took the money and fled with the criminals. The matter worsened for John, who was alone in the woods, taking news only from Mrs. Meckel for some time. For others, and was provided with some food every 2 or 3 days. After nearly 2 weeks, Joan decided to contact his teacher, Mick, to know for sure the situation in the village and whether they had news of what was happening in the city. But Mrs. Meckel was afraid and told him that they were monitoring the communications and she did not want to enter into cases with the police and gangs. But she suggested that she should buy him a mobile phone after 2 days not registered under a name to make it difficult for the police to track him if they were monitoring communications. And the police were actually monitoring communications because the village had no phones except the school landline. And they had already questioned the teacher, Mick, and he told them that Joan made calls from time to time to assure his family. 2 days later, John took the phone from Mrs. Meckel and she said to him, "Please, get rid of the phone as soon as the call ends and do not talk to them from where you sleep. Call while being at a far place to make sure whether they are following up the calls or not." On the next day, Joan disguised in a hat and sunglasses and entered the outskirts of the city, and Joan had changed his appearance a little. His beard had grown a little long. And Joan called his teacher Mick to ask him about the conditions of the village and he said to him, "Where are you?" "Joan? Everyone is looking for you." Joan said to him, "I am innocent and there is no room to explain everything." So the teacher said, "Surrender yourself, Joan, and all the issues will be resolved, believe me." He said to him, "Nobody will believe me. The issue is so complicated that I myself can hardly understand it." He stopped him and told him how the people of the village were. "How my family was, Katie, my mother and everyone," he said. "The situation is very bad and everyone is angry with you and they say that you have turned into a dangerous criminal and your father is embarrassed by everyone. As for your mother, her sorrow for you has increased and she mentions your relationship with the gangs. As for Katie, she decided to forget you and accused you of betrayal and deceit." Joan closed his mobile phone, broke it and threw it in the trash in the street and returned to the forest. Joan barely walked back 100 meters until a lot of police cars arrived at the place and they surrounded the place with weapons. John walked in disguise until farther and knew at the time that the police monitored phones in the village, so he decided not to contact them at all until He found a solution to that problem, and the police chief appeared on television with a report stating that they had found the first line of arresting that dangerous criminal and that they knew his name, fingerprints and everything that belonged to him, and that they closed the city outlets and that they have already been besieging him and it did not remain except little to catch him. On the other hand, the gangsters began threatening the chief of the police if Joan was not arrested as soon as possible. His reputation would be polluted with murder and chaos, and he promised them that his arrest would be done as soon as possible. It did not occur to Joan that he would come to the city with big dreams and to finish his university studies, that he would be wanted dead or alive for the most powerful criminal gangs in the country, as well as for justice represented in the police, and that he would remain a fugitive in the forest, losing everything, his family, his village, his lover, and his university, and to be alone in the forest with the 3 bags. Morals. Your setting for a specific goal is not necessarily that you will reach it. Something may happen between you and it. If it happens, move away from the problems, wait for a thought, rethink and try to find solutions and alternative plans, and do not give up.